Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. I have several videos that I'm about to release, but today's video is about books that I used for a course I taught for the poetry school on poetic journals. That course on the poetic journals was mainly based on American poets from the Beats generation and subsequent generations of poets who traveled to Asia and were inspired by their encounters with Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. As well as that, the Japanese Poetic Journal is a particular form that often features both prose and poetry together, and that also inspired these poets' writing and the way in which their poetry and the journal writing form met to form some specific tradition of poetry. The most important of these books for me was, for the time being, the Bootstrap book of poetic journals, and I believe I've shown it in a video before, in which case I will link that video above. And largely, to be fair, the course I gave was based on this book and the poets featured in this book, although I then ventured outwards to other influences that I thought should be featured. This book came out in 2007. It is co-edited by Tyler, Doherty and Tom Morgan, and it has a balance of poems as well as short articles and interviews that talk about poetic journals as a form and how each poet relates to that form, their influences, where they learned to write, and how they practice. As for the poems themselves, some are in very free, fragmented form like this, and others regularly experiment with layout, as is the case here with the different fonts, while other poets choose slightly tighter form like this. So you see a variety of ways in which these poets shape the form of the poetic journal. One major influence that drove many of them is Philip Whalen. Philip Whalen was an American poet who became a Zen Buddhist, and he was close to the Beat generation. And he really started, in many ways, this American school of poetic journals, and many of the poets in this book mention him or talk about his heritage. Among other figures that were really important are Joanne Kyger, and I thought it would be really interesting to read her journals. Specifically, this is the Japan and India journals from 1960 to 1964. Joanne Kyger was Gary Snyder's partner at the time, and so you see him featured indirectly in her writing here. So again, very, very close relationship with the Beat generation. Often women are not directly considered as Beat poets, so I thought it was interesting to really feature one a bit more prominently. And her journals are mostly prose. So you see here, there are sometimes very short entries, sometimes longer entries, explaining what's going on, what happens, what she sees. Then you will also have poems featured, or at least drafts of poems, just like short entries that are poetic lines featured in the journal. Which brings us to the Japanese Poetic Diaries. I have a book here edited by Earl, which, just like for the time being, is not in print anymore, so you might have to get second-hand copies if you're interested. And this features 4 specific Japanese diaries: the Tosa Diary, the Diary of Izumi Shikibu, the Narrow Road Through the Provinces, and the Birth Record of My Peonies. And what I appreciated about this is, well, in the Japanese tradition, first of all, there is less of a clear distinction between fiction and journaling, because there are fictional journals. And some of these here, for example, the main protagonist of the Tosa Diary is not the woman who is the first person narrator of the diary, even though the Tosa Diary is written as if written by a woman. So the narrator can be a fictional character, as it is in the Tosa diary, and in that way events recounted in the diary are based on reality but not always true to life. And geographical locations also can be imprecise or changed, so these diaries can move in and out of the real into fiction. And another feature is that prose and poetry are mixed in together in one long text. So you get some prose, and then a poem is featured, and then more prose, and then a poem is featured, which is something that has been borrowed by some of these more contemporary journal poets, and also something that some of my students at the course have started experimenting with, which is really exciting. So here you see, for example, on the page that you get prose poetry, prose poetry, prose poetry, and it is all together in one text. Characters often, in the midst of their life, will be writing poems. So characters will be doing something and then writing a poem, and then doing something and writing another poem. Or there will be call and response between two characters through poetry. And in that way, poems are a feature of everyday life. You can easily read The Narrow Road Through the Province, for example, by Basho, and other texts featured in this book online, because they are older texts. They are often available with no copyright as PDFs online, so you can easily access those texts even if you don't get this book. And the last one I wanted to get a little bit more into this idea that poetry was originally inspired also by Buddhism and by Buddhist cultures and writing, and I got the Wisdom Anthology of North American Buddhist poetry. I only used the introduction in my course because I needed to situate a little bit how Buddhism came into play in poetry writing, especially contemporary American poetry writing, and that was helpful. But now I am also reading the book with a lot of interest. There are authors I already know. For example, there is an excerpt of Dale Pendell, who has written about plant poison and plant medicine, and here there are excerpts from Pharmacopoeia and Pharmacodynamics, which are books that I very much like. It is edited by Andrew Schelling, who is also featured in For the Time Being, and some of the poets are Joanne Kyger, for example, or Jane Hirschfield, Tyler Doherty, who is actually the co-editor of this book. So you can see there's a lot of overlap. Shin Yu Pai is also featured in both, and Philip Whalen gets a section here, plus Gary Snyder, Chase Twitchell, other poets that I appreciate. I know some of you are very interested in journal writing. I assume some of you are interested in poetry if you're in this channel, you know. And I would like to know if any of you have an interest also in Buddhism or in any forms of poetic journal writing, because I could do more about that, if so. And I hope you enjoyed the topic of this short video, and I will see you again very soon with more content to come. Bye!